the original wording of unambiguous, clear, transparent consent is just out the window. If you can't reach out to people you're not already dealing with, how are you ever expected to grow? We need to see SMEs differently, and we need to acknowledge how different and how difficult it is for data protection regulation to apply to them as opposed to big players. Contextual advertising will only help specific products for people who visit similar products. The privacy directive has to be replaced somehow because it's completely antiquated and outdated.
Hello everyone, I am Sergio Maldonado and this is Masters of Privacy, a set of interviews covering the intersection of marketing, data, privacy and technology with a clear goal in mind, which is redefining the relationship between people, brands and media around transparency and control. Which is to say, we're aiming for real customer centricity, or if you will, human centricity. We regularly talk to DPOs, CMOs, CDOs and whoever else we find interesting and able to share valuable insights. So we hope you like it. Please do reach out if you have any ideas on future topics or speakers. Okay, back in July, Google announced that its Chrome browser would after all keep third-party cookies. This interview with Robin de Wouters is the first of 2 episodes building on that news. Today, we'll revisit an urgent need to update the EU's e-privacy directive in the face of its incompatibility with the GDPR. Most crucially, as many of you know, the former imposes consent on certain technologies, while the latter offers a choice of 6 different legal bases, consent being one of them. Robin de Wouters is the Director General for the Federation of European Data and Marketing, FEDMA, in Brussels. His background is in communication and public relations across the private, non-profit and institutional spheres, having previously worked in the field of human rights with Euromed Rights, the One Campaign and the UN. Robin is also the Vice Chair of the Board of the European Interactive Digital Advertising Alliance and the Communications Director and Spokesperson for Democrats Abroad Belgium, the international arm of the US Democratic Party. But don't worry, we're not getting into US politics this time around. Let's get started. Robin, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Let me ask you, what would it take for us to be able to rely on legitimate interest for digital marketing? Do you have any thoughts on that?
If we stick to the GDPR as a as a piece of legislation that is supposed to be one rule fits all for 27 markets, legitimate interest can be used for marketing purposes under 6.1(f). Now, the reason why it's tricky is because, of course, GDPR has kind of ushered in a wave of everything has to be based on consent. And that was a mistake from the get-go, in my view, that consent is obviously primordial and essential for many aspects of marketing. And of course, I'm going to talk mainly on the marketing aspects of these legal basis to process personal data, but it's not an all-encompassing solution. And we've seen with cookie consent fatigue, with just consent over consent that just doesn't make sense anymore, to the point where the original wording of unambiguous, clear, transparent consent is just out the window. And this is where we believe at FEDMA that legitimate interest really has to kind of get back the spotlight that it deserves, but also the power that it deserves, in the sense that if you talk from a purely marketing perspective, and I'm not talking here, taking a step back from the legalese, from the regulation, if you look at a marketer and at a company from a marketing perspective, if you can't reach out to people you're not already dealing with, how are you ever expected to grow? I mean, just think about it from a practical perspective. If I can't reach out to people who are not yet my customers, how do I get new customers? And to reach out to non-customers, you need legitimate interest. That's it. It doesn't make it more clear and simple than that. Then of course there needs to be rules in place. There needs to be safeguards. There needs to be some way to ensure that it's not a blank check. But that's where GDPR comes back into play, is that Article 6.1f legitimate interest doesn't just say you can use legitimate interest for marketing whatever you want to do. It also provides specific rules, such as a balancing test, a three-point balancing test. It also talks about, obviously, the rights to and the obligation to provide opt-outs. So if you're sending an email, if you're sending an ad, or delivering an ad or whatever, the consumer needs to have the right to opt out. And if the marketer, the company respects these rules, why wouldn't it be able to use legitimate interest?
There's always been that possibility of brokered consent, which many have already, sort of deemed as not valid consent, delegated consent, what every publisher has been doing. But if we are saying that's not consent, and I agree, that's kind of a joke when it comes to the definition of consent, then we should also agree that they need another legal basis. And yes, it seems like there's only one way out, which is legitimate interest. So the one thing that we did debate back in the day with Peter Craddock here is that somehow the enforcer, be it a supervisory authority or be it somewhere else, and it changes country by country, so perhaps not necessarily the EDPB, but the enforcer has to make it clear that under the Privacy Directive, technical necessity somehow could be extended beyond that very, very technical nature of serving a website, serving the connection or whatever. So while we get to something like that, what we have on the table now is Google saying that third-party cookies are staying.
Yes.
They're not going anywhere. Do you think that's going to help in any manner, the fact that now we do not have to be looking at alternatives? Was it looking good to you, what we had on the table as a plan B?
So the decision not to phase out third-party cookies clearly came out as a big surprise. And I think, to answer your question, the process has gone too far now to backtrack in terms of alternative identifiers, alternative ways to provide personalized advertising or personalized services to consumers. Realistically, we've been talking about the phasing out third-party cookies for 3 years now. I think at the very least, it's been postponed several times. We even had, Google Chrome went into a beta testing earlier this year when they phased out 1% of third-party cookies. So to backtrack now, for whatever reason they may have, and I don't know what is really the reason. Probably the ICO and the CMA in the UK and so on are most probably behind some of the decision or the reasoning. But a lot of players, most players have been preparing, and now it's just too late, I think. So we're going to see a rise, I think, of alternatives. Google has made it clear that their APIs, the privacy sandbox, everything stays in place. So they're not pulling out everything. What we want to ensure, on the other hand, is that we don't go on a browser-based consent, because that would provide disproportionate power to a single player, that the browser, basically, that they would be able to just decide regardless of the other identifiers, because in the end, no identifier will matter if the browser decides to go the other way.
That's it. I wanted to get there. Thank you. That's very well put. That's exactly it. So, by the looks of it, first, the privacy sandbox, the way it was looking, if we had kept going and Google had deprecated third-party cookies this year, from my point of view, it wasn't looking good. From the point of view of the annoyance that you referred to earlier, which is consent on top of consent, and people not really knowing what they agree to. So I always thought if there was a way to get rid of the consent management banner, of the cookie banner, and make things easier for people, that would be it. Something that is more privacy preserving, that at the same time allows for frequency capping, fraud detection, basic interest-based targeting. So I thought Topics API was promising. Yeah.
Yes.
But something happened, which is the French authority, I guess others after that, so the CNIL, made it clear that Topics API would require consent. And that because he was reading from the device and writing to the device, even though it was so innocuous, even after all the watering down, due to, again, to complaints about possible fingerprinting and so on, if even that was going to require consent, why would you simply stop short at using topics which were proven to be, again, to have an impact in terms of, loading times, page loading times, in terms of lower revenue for publishers after that test with the 1% that you were referring to, by, reported by Criteo and others taking part in the test. So why would we simply use topics? If you need to ask for consent no matter what, then it makes sense, as you are referring to now as well, to go all the way to IDs that somewhat can be used across multiple properties. So now you have Google backtracking, and on the one hand, I think there's one piece of good news here, which is that if we rely on the browser, it is true. If Google is also a player in the same market, it sounds terribly unfair. If Google was not to be an actor in the same market, sort of speculating in that open market, then the fact that the browser is the place where I get to, in a single strike, decide whether I want or not personalized ads or different levels of intrusiveness, I think is good insofar as I can get rid of the annoying cookie banners, So I see that. And then the alternative to that, as you were saying, is only legitimate interest. Otherwise, you're going to be trapped. We're going to be stuck with 1,000 millions of consent banners.
Yes.
Do you see any other way out?
I mean, this question makes me think of a really good example that could have been and might still be a way forward. So I think it's important, and this is where really FEDMA tries to position itself, and it's really our strength, is that we need to distinguish small and medium enterprises from, gatekeepers, big tech, big platforms, and so on. I think I don't want to talk, I don't want to say that we need a dual track approach, like legally speaking, but we do need to realize that there are different aspects and that they don't apply the same way to all players. And the point I'm making here is that in the DPDI bill, so the data protection bill that was supposed to pass in the UK before there was the snap election and the wash up and it didn't go through and so on. But now there's a new law that is in the works and that could still work it out. In the original DPDI bill, there was a position that small players, small websites would not have to use cookie consent banners anymore, because it doesn't make sense if you're going on the website of your local baker, and it's a very, very maybe silly example, but that you need to accept cookies for such a small website. Then, of course, if you go to a website where sometimes there are some platforms where they say us and 835, third-party vendors, do you accept to give your consents to? That's like, okay, we need to have two ways to approach these things. So when it comes to small players, when it comes to, and by small we can define, it's not about setting a specific like rule or line, but we need to see SMEs differently, and we need to acknowledge how different and how difficult it is for data protection regulation to apply to them as opposed to big players. And that's the crux of it. So for small players, legitimate interest should definitely be a primordial or like a maybe even first recourse. It's okay if they don't get the consent. Again, with the concept that the consumer can always opt out, that it needs to be a balancing test and so on. It's not like, just a straight line. And for other players where there's a lot more at stake, yes, consent might have to be more, privileged. But when it comes to topics, just to finish on that, studies have shown that consumers want personalized experience, and they appreciate a granular approach. They don't want micro-targeting. They don't want to get ads because they just went to a specific store, buying a specific online store, and bought a specific object, whatever, and there's some categorizations make it quite creepy, but overall they do favor a granular approach. So the concept of topics or other tools that allow to choose, I would like to have a personalized approach to traveling and tourism, but not automobile and motorcycles, whatever. Yeah, sure. That makes sense.
Very good points. I really was very happy with that proposal in the UK to exempt small businesses. Like they were talking about the church and the local gym and whatever. And it's so true. They're very small. They cannot adapt. They cannot be changing their banners every other day. They never get to deploy. They can't even afford probably a CMP that works, if any of them actually works as intended. So it's for smaller companies, it made all the sense. That's really good. And what you're saying on this, they need to advertise as well.
Yes.
So I can see that first, there's little risk of them playing a part in the data brokerage market. So there's less risk. I can see that, across the board when, I'm served a cookie by a tiny retailer. But at the same time, they need to advertise. They need that data. Why? Because they cannot afford to shoot at everybody. If I'm only making, recycled sandals,
yes,
my audience is very small. So I do see the benefit of using lookalikes. If only Meta, with a direct relationship, are allowed to do lookalikes because they enjoy that, again, relationship and that data, then how is ever the open market, how is it ever going to compete when, as a small retailer, I do need targeting? Contextual, to me, sounds like a joke unless it can be cross-site context, right? So do you see them playing any role, small retailers? How do you see them being pushed around by all of these changes? Have you felt anything?
I mean, you brought up contextual advertising, and I completely agree that it's not even half a solution. Contextual advertising will only help specific products for people who visit similar products. So again, going back to my earlier point about how to, engage with the new base to expand your customer base, contextual advertising is not going to work. I think really the crux, the problem, or what it comes down to, is regulators have to stop thinking that customers have to be held by the hand on every single thing. Customers, users, internet users have a mind of their own. They can make their own decisions. It doesn't mean that we have every right to do whatever we want as an industry. Far from it. We need to respect their fundamental rights, but we have to stop assuming always that they have no idea what's going on. And the problem is that the consequence of over-regulation, because this is what we're seeing is regulation over regulation over regulation, is that it's not making it clearer for consumers or giving them more control. It's getting them more confused. And usually that confusion turns into anger, or frustration towards the industry, because that's they're the ones facing consumers, not the regulators. So there needs to be this reckoning, and there needs to be, and this is why we really advocate for stronger stakeholder exchanges, with a harmonized approach between regulations, Now we're looking at the AI Act. There's going to be the need now for an AI policy to be added to the privacy policy on website for any player that uses AI. And by that, we're talking if your email marketer is using ChatGPT to create content, you're using AI as a company, meaning you're probably going to have an AI policy. How is that going to help clarity for the consumer? So to your question about what should we do about small players, about small businesses and so on, we need to support them with ways that they can be compliant without having to go through 16 different regulations that not only are many in amount, and again, and I'm not saying that they're not necessary. Digital Services Act, Digital Markets Act, Data Act, they're all very useful pieces of regulation, but they need to work together. They need to function as one set of rules rather than 16 sets of rules. And that's the only way we're going to help small businesses.
Very good point. Have we gone too fast with all of these regulations, like DSA, DMA? They all came up. They all came out of nowhere. We used to look at these things, the process. I used to live in Brussels, so things would take years, forever.
Yeah.
And there was this back and forth, this ping pong, eternal ping pong.
I think I respect the fact that regulators want to go faster. I mean, when you look at the GDPR, I think, yes, it took 6 years or 5 years, I think, before it was actually, a piece of legislation. But realistically, regulation needs to adapt faster to technology. And again, I don't think it's realistic to assume that regulation will be on the same par and the same speed as technology, because technology will always be faster. And that's a fact. But that's where self-regulation comes into play. Industry self-regulation can fill the gaps between technological advancements and the regulation that follows, while regulation kind of, follows up.
Robin, thank you. Any last thing you want to say? Anything that we should read? Any thoughts in mind? Anything we should be waiting for? Something coming around the corner from a Brussels perspective? Anything in your mind? Last words?
Oh, I mean, there's a lot. It's hard to say to have a clear idea of what's coming next, given that we have a new commission and a new parliament starting now. I mean, in the very, very near future. Obviously, e-privacy regulation is going to be a big topic. Because there are rumors that it's going to be withdrawn and it'll be replaced maybe with other, I mean, the e-privacy directive has to be replaced somehow because it's completely antiquated and outdated. So if it's not the e-privacy regulation, it has to be something to at least certain aspects of the e-privacy directive. But what comes next, we'll have to see with the new commission and the new parliament. But really what we want at FEDMA is better interplay, better harmonization, and better support for the industry, and specifically small players.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very useful.
Thank you.
Okay, that's all for today. Please follow the Masters of Privacy channel on LinkedIn if you want to find some interview transcripts, cheat sheets, and other useful resources and surprises every now and then. On top of that, episode notes and other feeds are available on mastersofprivacy.com. Thank you for listening.